Carl Jung explained, letting go is the highest form of inner power. There exists a psychological truth so powerful, so threatening to the established order, that it was buried deep within the archives of analytical psychology. Carl Jung discovered it during his most intensive period of self-analysis, when he was descending into what he called his own personal underworld. This discovery would change everything he understood about human nature, about power, and about the very essence of psychological freedom. But here's what they don't want you to know. This truth was deliberately obscured, not by some grand conspiracy, but by something far more insidious, by our own collective resistance to genuine liberation. Because once you understand what Jung really discovered about letting go, once you see through the illusion that's been controlling your entire existence, there's no going back to the comfortable prison of unconscious living. Most people spend their entire lives gripping onto things that were never meant to be held. We clutch our identities like drowning men clutch driftwood, not realizing that the very act of clinging is what's pulling us under. We hold so tightly to our personas, our roles, our need to control outcomes, that we've forgotten what it feels like to breathe freely. Jung understood something that would shake the foundations of how we think about strength and weakness. He realized that what we call power, our ability to control, manipulate, and force outcomes, is actually the highest form of spiritual imprisonment. And conversely, what we've been taught to see as weakness, the ability to let go, to surrender control, to trust the unknown, this is where true power lies. Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves, Jung wrote. But he was pointing to something even more radical than simple self-reflection. He was revealing that our desperate need to control others, to judge them, to hold them to our expectations, is nothing more than a projection of our own inner tyranny. We treat others the way our unconscious treats us, with relentless demands, impossible standards, and the constant threat that love will be withdrawn if we don't perform correctly. Think about this for a moment. Every criticism you've ever leveled at another person, every judgment that's ever made your blood boil, every time you've thought they should be different, all of it is a mirror showing you exactly where you're imprisoned by your own unconscious patterns. The anger you feel toward the controlling person is your own need for control reflected back at you. The irritation you experience with someone who won't let go is your own death grip on life showing itself. This is why Jung's teaching about letting go was so dangerous. Because once you see this pattern, once you understand that your external world is a perfect reflection of your internal landscape, you can no longer blame anyone else for your suffering. You can no longer pretend that your problems are out there instead of in here. You're forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that you've been the author of your own imprisonment all along. But here's where it gets even more uncomfortable. The very things you think make you strong, your achievements, your image, your ability to make things happen, these have become your psychological chains. You've built an entire identity around being the person who has it together, who can handle anything, who never shows weakness. And now that identity has become a prison that you defend with your life. Jung discovered that this isn't just individual pathology, it's a collective disease. Our entire culture is built on the premise that holding on is strength and letting go is weakness. We're taught to accumulate, to achieve, to build impressive personas, to never give up, to fight for what we want. We're indoctrinated into believing that surrender is defeat, that acceptance is giving up, that trusting the process is naive optimism. This cultural programming runs so deep that most people can't even imagine what life would look like without the constant struggle to control outcomes. They've never experienced the profound peace that comes from genuine surrender, the incredible power that emerges when you stop fighting reality, the creative force that flows through you when you get your ego out of the way. You see, Jung wasn't just a psychologist, he was a revolutionary. He was showing us a pathway to psychological liberation that threatened every power structure built on human unconsciousness. Think about it. What would happen to our economic systems if people stopped being driven by the compulsive need to accumulate? What would happen to our political structures if people stopped projecting their shadow onto external enemies? What would happen to our social hierarchies if people stopped deriving their identity from status and achievement? The implications are staggering. A truly conscious human being, someone who has learned the art of letting go, becomes ungovernable by external authorities because they've learned to govern themselves. They can't be manipulated through fear because they've made peace with uncertainty. They can't be controlled through their attachments because they've learned to hold everything lightly. They become a force of nature, operating from a place of inner authority that no external power can touch. This is why the deepest teachings about letting go have been hidden in plain sight. They're discussed in academic circles, buried in complex psychological terminology, wrapped in so much intellectual packaging that the revolutionary essence gets lost. Because if people really understood what Jung was pointing toward, if they really grasped the transformative power of conscious surrender, it would change everything. But you're here now, which means you're ready for something different. You're ready to stop living your life according to other people's definitions of strength and weakness. You're ready to discover what real power looks like, not the power to control others, but the power to free yourself from the unconscious patterns that have been running your life. The journey we're about to take together will challenge everything you think you know about success, happiness, and personal growth. We're going to explore the hidden mechanisms of psychological imprisonment, the unconscious patterns that keep you trapped in cycles of suffering, and most importantly, the specific practices that can set you free. But I need to warn you, this isn't comfortable material. Jung called this work the most terrifying thing because it requires you to face parts of yourself you've spent your entire life trying to avoid. It means letting go of the identity you've worked so hard to build. It means surrendering the illusion that you can control how life unfolds. It means trusting something larger than your ego, something that your rational mind can't grasp or manipulate. Most people aren't ready for this level of psychological honesty. They prefer the familiar suffering of unconscious living to the unknown territory of authentic existence. They'd rather stay trapped in patterns that feel secure than risk the vulnerability of genuine growth. They choose the devil they know over the freedom they don't. But you're still here, which tells me something important about who you are. You're one of those rare individuals who would rather face the truth than live comfortably in illusion. You're willing to do the inner work that most people avoid. You're ready to discover what Jung really meant when he talked about individuation, the process of becoming who you actually are instead of who you think you should be. So let me ask you this. What are you holding on to right now that's keeping you small? What aspect of your identity have you been defending so fiercely that it's become a prison? What outcome are you trying to control so desperately that you've forgotten how to enjoy the process of living? Take a moment to really feel into these questions, because your answers will determine whether this journey transforms your life or remains just another interesting video you watched. The secret Jung discovered is that letting go isn't about becoming passive or resigned. It's about accessing a level of inner power that most people never even know exists. It's about learning to dance with life instead of trying to choreograph every step. It's about discovering that when you stop forcing doors open, the right ones swing open effortlessly. This is the forbidden teaching that we're going to explore together. That your greatest strength lies not in what you can hold on to, but in what you're brave enough to release. not in what you can control, but in what you can trust, not in who you can impress, but in who you can authentically be when all the masks come off. Are you ready to discover what real power looks like? Are you willing to let go of everything you think you know about strength and weakness? Because once we start down this path, once you see what Jung saw about the nature of psychological freedom, your life will never be the same. Right now, as you're listening to these words, you're living inside a prison. But this isn't a prison made of bars and concrete. It's far more sophisticated than that. It's a prison made of thoughts, beliefs, expectations, and attachments that feel so natural, so much like you, that you've never questioned whether they're actually serving your highest good. Jung understood something that would shock most people. The human mind, in its default state, is not an instrument of freedom. It's a mechanism of imprisonment. Every day, without realizing it, you're collaborating with your own psychological incarceration. You're volunteering for a life sentence in a jail cell that you've decorated so beautifully, you've forgotten you're locked inside. Let me paint you a picture of what this looks like in real life. Meet David, a successful executive who on paper had everything. Corner office, six-figure salary, respect from his peers, a beautiful family, a house in the suburbs that could grace the cover of a magazine. By every conventional measure, David was winning at life. But David had a secret that he could barely admit to himself. He was miserable. Every morning, David would wake up with a knot of anxiety in his stomach. Not because anything was wrong, but because everything had to stay right. He was holding his entire life together through sheer force of will, managing every detail, controlling every variable, making sure that the perfect image he'd constructed never cracked. His identity had become so intertwined with his success that he couldn't tell where David ended and the achievement began. David lived in constant fear that his performance would slip, that his team would let him down, that his wife would discover he wasn't as confident as he appeared, that his children would see through the facade of having it all figured out. He was running a psychological corporation where he was simultaneously the CEO, the security guard, and the prisoner, working 18-hour days to maintain an image that was slowly killing him from the inside. This is what Jung meant when he talked about the unconscious prison. David wasn't trapped by external circumstances. He was trapped by his attachment to being the person who had it together. He couldn't let go of his need to control outcomes because his entire sense of self was built on being the one who made things happen. He couldn't show vulnerability because that would threaten the persona he'd spent decades constructing. He couldn't trust the process because that would mean admitting he wasn't in charge. But here's what's truly insidious about psychological imprisonment. The bars are invisible, so we never think to examine them. David never questioned whether his need to control everything was actually giving him control or whether it was controlling him. He never asked whether his perfectionism was creating perfection or whether it was creating a perfectionist, someone who could never be satisfied with anything less than an impossible standard. Jung discovered that most of what we call personality is actually just a collection of unconscious survival strategies that we developed early in life and then forgot we were using. We learn to be the good child, the achiever, the helper, the rebel, the victim, the hero, whatever role seemed most likely to get our needs met and keep us safe. And then, somewhere along the way, we started believing that these roles were who we actually are. Think about your own life for a moment. How much of your daily experience is driven by the need to maintain a certain image of yourself? How much energy do you spend trying to control how others perceive you? How often do you make decisions based not on what you actually want, but on what you think you should want? How frequently do you find yourself defending positions that you're not even sure you believe, just because you've identified with them? This is the unconscious prison in action. You've become so attached to being a certain type of person that you've forgotten you have a choice about who to be. You're so invested in maintaining consistency with your past self that you've cut yourself off from the possibility of growth. You're so afraid of disappointing the people who know you as X that you can't explore the possibility of becoming Y. The cruel irony is that the very strategies we use to feel secure actually create more insecurity. David's need to control everything created a life where he felt constantly out of control. His perfectionism didn't create perfect outcomes. It created a person who was never satisfied with any outcome. His image management didn't make him more lovable. It made him feel like no one could love the real him because no one had ever seen the real him. Jung saw this pattern everywhere he looked. People desperately trying to hold their lives together, not realizing that their desperate holding was what was falling apart. Individuals fighting for control, not seeing that their fighting was what made them powerless. Human beings working tirelessly to construct the perfect life, not understanding that their construction project had become their prison. But the deepest level of this unconscious imprisonment is even more subtle. It's not just that we're attached to certain outcomes or identities, it's that we're attached to the process of attachment itself. We've become addicted to the feeling of holding on, to the illusion that if we just grip tightly enough, we can make life bend to our will. This addiction to control shows up everywhere. In relationships where we try to change our partners into the people we think they should be, not realizing that our need to change them is what's changing us into controllers, manipulators, people who can't love what is because we're so obsessed with what should be. In our careers, where we exhaust ourselves trying to force outcomes, not seeing that our forcing is often what prevents the natural unfolding that would bring us what we actually need. In our personal growth, where we treat consciousness work like another project to master, another area where we can prove our competence, not understanding that true growth happens in the space between thoughts, in the moments when we're not trying to grow, in the stillness that emerges when we stop working so hard at being better. The unconscious prison is maintained by a simple but powerful delusion, the belief that you are your thoughts, not that you have thoughts, but that you are your thoughts, not that you experience emotions, but that you are your emotions, not that you play roles, but that you are those roles. This identification is so complete, so automatic, that questioning it feels like questioning your very existence. But Jung discovered something revolutionary. Consciousness is not the prisoner. Consciousness is the space in which the prison appears. You are not the anxious thoughts about the future. You are the awareness in which those thoughts arise and pass away. You are not the painful emotions from the past. You are the witnessing presence that experiences those emotions without being destroyed by them. You are not the roles you play. You are the conscious being who can step into and out of those roles at will. This distinction might sound abstract, but it's the key to everything. Because once you recognize that you are the space in which your experience unfolds, rather than the experience itself, everything changes. You realize that you don't have to be at the mercy of every thought that crosses your mind. You don't have to be controlled by every emotion that moves through your system. You don't have to be imprisoned by every role you've learned to play. The unconscious prison is maintained by unconsciousness, by our failure to recognize that we have a choice about how to relate to our internal experience. The moment you wake up to the fact that you are not your thoughts, not your emotions, not your roles, not your story about yourself, the prison door swings open. Not because the prison disappears, but because you realize you were never actually locked inside. But here's what makes this work so challenging. The ego, the part of you that thinks it's running the show, is terrified of this recognition. Because if you're not your thoughts, then the thinker is revealed to be unnecessary. If you're not your emotions, then the emotional drama loses its grip on you. If you're not your roles, then all the energy you've invested in maintaining those roles seems suddenly ridiculous. The ego would rather keep you imprisoned in familiar suffering than free you into unfamiliar joy. It would rather have you be miserable in ways that make sense than happy, in ways that threaten its authority. It would rather keep you small and controllable than large and unpredictable. This is why letting go feels so threatening. It's not just that you're releasing specific attachments, you're challenging the very mechanism that creates attachment. You're questioning the fundamental assumption that holding on creates security. You're investigating whether the one who thinks they need to hold on actually exists in the way you've been imagining. Take a moment right now to notice what's happening in your mind as you hear these words. Are you trying to figure out how to apply this information? Are you analyzing whether you agree or disagree? Are you comparing your experience to what's being described? Notice how quickly the mind turns even radical ideas about freedom into another project for the ego to manage. This is the unconscious prison in real time. Even when presented with the possibility of liberation, the mind immediately tries to turn liberation into another form of captivity. It wants to understand freedom so it can control freedom. It wants to master letting go so it can add good at letting go to its resume of accomplishments. But here's what Jung discovered. You cannot think your way out of the unconscious prison because thinking is what maintains the prison. You cannot analyze your way to freedom because analysis is another form of control. You cannot strategically plan your liberation because strategy is just sophisticated imprisonment. The way out is not through more mental activity, it's through recognizing the space in which mental activity appears. It's not through better thoughts, it's through discovering what you are when you're not thinking. It's not through emotional regulation, it's through finding what remains constant while emotions come and go. David's transformation began the day he stopped trying to manage his anxiety and started investigating who was experiencing the anxiety. Instead of fighting the knot in his stomach, he began to explore the awareness that noticed the knot. Instead of trying to control his team's performance, he started examining his need to control. Instead of working harder to maintain his perfect image, he began to question who needed the image to be perfect. What he discovered shocked him. There was a part of himself that remained completely unaffected by whether he succeeded or failed, whether he was approved of or criticized, whether his life looked perfect or fell apart. This part of himself had been there all along, quietly witnessing the drama of his life without being disturbed by it. It was like discovering that he'd been living his entire life in the front seat of a car, gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles, not realizing there was someone else driving. This is the beginning of psychological freedom, recognizing that you are not the prisoner, but the space in which the prison appears. You are not the problem, but the awareness in which problems arise and resolve. You are not the one who needs to let go. You are the letting go itself, the natural relaxation that happens when you stop pretending to be someone you never were. But don't take my word for it. Right now, as you're listening to these words, notice what's aware of the listening. Notice what's present, whether the words are inspiring or challenging, whether you're agreeing or disagreeing, whether you're understanding or confused. That which notices without being changed by what it notices. That's who you really are. That's what's never been imprisoned. That's what's already free. The question isn't how to get out of the unconscious prison. The question is, who do you think you are that needs to get out? And what if the one who thinks they're trapped is just another prisoner, and you are the space in which both the prisoner and the prison appear? Comment below if you've started to notice the difference between your experience and the one who experiences, because once you see this distinction, even for a moment, you'll never be able to fully believe in your own imprisonment again. There is a mask you wear that is so convincing, so perfectly crafted, that you've forgotten it's not your actual face. This mask has been molded by every expectation you've ever tried to meet, every approval you've ever sought, every rejection you've ever feared. It has become so familiar, so much a part of your daily existence, that you've begun to believe this carefully constructed image is who you actually are. Jung called this mask the persona, and he understood something that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. The persona is not just something you put on when you go out into the world. It's a sophisticated psychological survival system that has colonized your inner landscape. You don't just wear the mask for others, you wear it for yourself. You've become so identified with your persona that you've lost touch with the authentic being who lives beneath it. The persona is a complicated system of relations between individual consciousness and society. Fittingly enough, a kind of mask designed on the one hand to make a definite impression upon others, and on the other to conceal the true nature of the individual, Jung wrote. But he was pointing to something even more radical than social pretense. He was revealing how we become psychologically addicted to being who we think we should be, even when that persona is slowly strangling the life out of us. Let me introduce you to Sarah, a woman who had perfected the art of persona maintenance to such a degree that she'd become a prisoner of her own success at being likable. Sarah was the perfect mother, the supportive wife, the helpful friend, the reliable colleague. She was the person everyone turned to in a crisis, the one who always had it together, the shoulder everyone cried on, the problem solver who never had problems of her own. Sarah's persona was so convincing that even she believed it most of the time. She genuinely thought she was naturally giving, inherently selfless, born to serve others. She told herself that her constant caretaking was just who she was, that her inability to say no was evidence of her good heart, that her exhaustion was a small price to pay for being needed and appreciated. But late at night, when the house was quiet and everyone else's needs had been met, Sarah would sometimes catch a glimpse of something else lurking beneath the surface. A flash of resentment, a moment of rage, a whisper of, "What about me?" that she would quickly suppress because good mothers, supportive wives, and helpful friends don't have selfish thoughts like that. Sarah had become so skilled at reading what others needed from her and delivering it perfectly that she'd completely lost touch with what she needed from life. Her persona had become so elaborate, so all-consuming, that she couldn't tell where the performance ended and her authentic self began. She was like an actor who had been playing the same role for so long that they'd forgotten they were acting. This is the insidious nature of persona identification. It doesn't feel like pretense when you're living it. It feels like virtue. Sarah didn't think she was being fake. She thought she was being good. She didn't recognize her people-pleasing as manipulation. She saw it as love. She didn't understand that her constant giving was actually a sophisticated form of control, a way of ensuring that she would always be needed and therefore never abandoned. The persona becomes addictive because it works, at least on the surface. It gets you the approval you crave, the acceptance you've been seeking, the sense of belonging you've always wanted. But like any addiction, the persona demands an increasingly higher dose to achieve the same effect. Sarah had to become more selfless, more available, more perfect to maintain the image that had become her identity. Jung discovered that this persona addiction is not just individual pathology, it's a collective disease. Our entire culture is organized around persona maintenance. We're taught from the earliest age to figure out what others want from us and deliver it convincingly. We learn to read the room, to adapt our behavior, to present the version of ourselves that will be most welcome in any given situation. Think about your own persona construction project. How much of your day is spent performing a version of yourself rather than expressing yourself? How often do you find yourself saying what you think others want to hear rather than what you actually think? How frequently do you make choices based on how they'll look rather than how they'll feel? How much energy do you spend maintaining an image that may not even reflect who you really are? The persona is seductive because it promises safety. If you can just figure out the right way to be, if you can just perfect your performance, then you'll be loved, accepted, successful, secure. The persona whispers that authenticity is dangerous, that being real means risking rejection, that showing your true face might reveal something unlovable. But Jung saw through this seductive promise. He understood that the persona doesn't actually create safety. It creates the constant anxiety of maintaining an image. It doesn't generate genuine love. It attracts people to a version of you that doesn't actually exist. It doesn't provide real security. It builds your entire life on the unstable foundation of other people's approval. The deepest tragedy of persona identification is that it cuts you off from your own life force. When you're constantly performing, you lose touch with your spontaneous responses. When you're always managing your image, you forget what it feels like to simply be. When you're perpetually adapting to others' expectations, you lose contact with your own desires, your own instincts, your own natural way of moving through the world. Sarah's breakthrough came during what she later called the morning I couldn't get out of bed. She woke up to find that the engine that had been driving her for decades had simply stopped. She couldn't muster the energy to make breakfast for her family. She couldn't summon the enthusiasm to solve her friend's latest crisis. She couldn't generate the warmth that everyone expected from her. For the first time in her adult life, Sarah's persona had malfunctioned. The perfectly calibrated performance system that had been running her life had crashed, and she was left facing a terrifying question. If she wasn't the helpful one, the giving one, the person who always had it together, then who was she? This persona breakdown, while initially terrifying, was actually the beginning of Sarah's liberation. Because when the mask finally cracked, when the performance became impossible to maintain, she discovered something shocking. She was still there. Underneath all the roles, beneath all the adaptation, beyond all the people-pleasing, there was still a Sarah who existed independent of everyone else's needs and expectations. This authentic Sarah was not as nice as the persona Sarah, but she was infinitely more real. She had opinions that weren't designed to please anyone. She had desires that weren't about serving others. She had boundaries that weren't negotiable based on others' feelings. She had a life force that wasn't dependent on external validation. She had a voice that didn't need permission to speak. Jung called this discovery process individuation, the gradual separation of your authentic self from the persona you've been performing. But individuation is not just a psychological concept. It's a revolutionary act. In a world that profits from your persona maintenance, becoming authentic is a form of rebellion. In a culture that depends on your people-pleasing, developing boundaries is an act of defiance. In a society built on persona performance, simply being yourself becomes a radical statement. The persona serves not just individual needs, but collective ones. Your family needs you to be the role you've always played because it maintains the family system. Your workplace needs you to be professionally manageable because it keeps the organizational structure intact. Society needs you to be predictably responsive to social pressure because it maintains the status quo. When you begin to disentangle your authentic self from your persona, you're not just changing yourself, you're challenging every system that has benefited from your unconscious performance. This is why individuation often creates relationship crises, career upheavals, and social disruption. It's not because you're becoming difficult, it's because you're becoming real, and reality is disruptive to systems built on pretense. But here's what makes persona work so tricky. The goal is not to destroy the persona entirely. The persona serves important social functions. You need different aspects of yourself to show up in different contexts. The problem arises when you become identified with the persona, when you forget that it's a tool you can use rather than an identity you are trapped inside. The healthy relationship with persona is like the relationship between an actor and their roles. A skilled actor can fully embody a character while knowing they are not that character. They can access different parts of themselves for different roles while maintaining a sense of their own core identity. They can perform convincingly without losing themselves in the performance. Sarah's healing involved learning to relate to her helpful persona as one facet of herself rather than the totality of who she was. She could still be supportive and caring when it felt authentic, but she no longer felt compelled to be helpful in every situation. She could still be generous with others, but she no longer gave from an empty cup. She could still be loving, but her love was no longer conditional on being needed. This shift from persona identification to persona flexibility is one of the most liberating transformations you can experience. It means you can show up differently in different situations without losing your sense of self. You can adapt to social requirements without abandoning your authentic nature. You can be diplomatic when necessary without feeling like you're betraying yourself. But this flexibility requires something that most people are terrified to develop: the willingness to be disliked by some people in service of being authentic to yourself. The persona promises universal approval at the cost of your soul. Authenticity offers selective approval at the gift of your life force. Jung understood that this choice between persona safety and authentic aliveness is the defining choice of human existence. Most people choose the persona because the short-term comfort outweighs the long-term cost. They would rather be liked for who they're pretending to be than risk being rejected for who they actually are. But some people like you who are still listening to these words, choose differently. They choose the uncertain path of authenticity over the secure path of performance. They choose the messy reality of being human over the polished facade of being perfect. They choose the risky territory of self-expression over the safe zone of social approval. This choice is not made once, but continuously. Every day, in countless small moments, you face the decision: persona or authenticity, performance or expression, safety or aliveness. The accumulation of these micro-choices determines whether you live as yourself or as a sophisticated imitation of yourself. Right now, take a moment to notice. What version of yourself are you being as you listen to these words? Are you the good student trying to understand and apply everything correctly? Are you the spiritual seeker looking for the next level of consciousness to achieve? Are you the skeptical analyst evaluating whether this information fits your existing worldview? Are you the evolved person who already knows all this but enjoys hearing it articulated? Notice how quickly the mind creates a persona even around personal growth material. Notice how the ego wants to turn even the teaching about authenticity into another performance. This is not wrong, it's just the nature of the persona-making mechanism, but awareness of it is the beginning of freedom from it. The mask you wear is not evil, but it is not you. The roles you play are not wrong, but they are not your identity. The persona you've perfected is not bad, but it is not your authentic face. The real question is, are you ready to meet yourself without the mask? Are you prepared to discover who you are when you're not trying to be anyone in particular? Because underneath every persona, behind every mask, beyond every performance, there is a being of such authenticity, such natural presence, such spontaneous aliveness, that no persona could ever contain it. This being doesn't need to be improved or perfected or made more acceptable. This being is already complete, already lovable, already enough, exactly as it is. The persona mask is kept in place by the fear that this authentic being might not be acceptable to others. But Jung discovered something remarkable. The people who are meant to be in your life will love your authentic self more than they ever loved your persona. And the people who can only love your persona were never actually loving you anyway. They were loving your performance. The choice before you is simple but not easy. Continue perfecting the mask or risk removing it. Continue being who you think you should be or discover who you actually are. Continue the performance or step into authenticity. The mask has served you well, but the question remains, are you ready to show your real face? There is a part of you that you've been running from your entire life. It's the part that holds all the qualities you've deemed unacceptable, all the impulses you've learned to suppress, all the aspects of human nature that you've decided are not compatible with being a good person. Jung called this the shadow, and he discovered something that will completely revolutionize how you understand your emotional reactions to others. Everything you hate in other people is actually revealing something you hate in yourself. This isn't psychology. This is spiritual dynamite. Because once you understand the mechanics of shadow projection, once you see how your judgments of others are actually a map of your own unconscious territory, you can no longer blame anyone else for triggering you. You realize that every person who annoys you, frustrates you, or enrages you is actually serving as an unwitting teacher, showing you exactly where your own disowned material is hidden. Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves, Jung wrote. But most people read this quote and think it's about being more understanding of others. They miss the radical implications. Your external world is a perfect mirror reflecting your internal landscape back to you with stunning accuracy. The people who trigger you most intensely are showing you the parts of yourself that you've exiled into the darkness of the unconscious. Think about the last time someone really got under your skin. Maybe it was the arrogant colleague who always dominates meetings. Maybe it was the needy friend who never stops talking about their problems. Maybe it was the controlling parent who can't stop giving unsolicited advice. Maybe it was the selfish partner who always makes everything about them. Now here's the question that will disturb you. What if your intense reaction to these people has nothing to do with their behavior and everything to do with your relationship to those same qualities within yourself? What if your anger at the arrogant colleague is actually your disowned arrogance trying to get your attention? What if your frustration with the needy friend is actually your own neediness that you've been suppressing? What if your rage at the controlling parent is actually your own control issues reflected back at you? This is the shadow projection mechanism that Jung discovered, and it operates with mathematical precision. The intensity of your emotional charge toward someone else's behavior is directly proportional to how much you've disowned that same behavior in yourself. The more you hate something in another person, the more likely it is that you possess that same quality, but have buried it so deeply that you can't see it. Let me introduce you to Marcus, a successful therapist who prided himself on being emotionally balanced, professionally competent, and psychologically evolved. Marcus had done years of therapy, attended countless workshops, and read every self-help book he could find. He considered himself to be self-aware, conscious, and emotionally mature. But Marcus had one trigger that could send him into a rage faster than anything else: clients who he perceived as manipulative. When someone would try to get him to break his boundaries, when they would play victim to avoid taking responsibility, when they would use emotional manipulation to get their way, Marcus would feel a fury so intense it shocked him. He would find himself having fantasies of confronting these clients, of exposing their manipulation, of making them face their own dishonesty. Marcus told himself that his anger was justified. After all, manipulation is wrong. These clients were being dishonest. Someone needed to call them out on their behavior. But Jung would have asked Marcus a different question. Why does this particular behavior trigger such an intense response in you when other equally problematic behaviors don't? Why wasn't Marcus equally triggered by clients who were lazy or dishonest in other ways or emotionally distant? Why was manipulation his particular hot button? The answer came during Marcus's own therapy session when his therapist asked him to describe his childhood relationship with his mother. As Marcus began to speak, he found himself describing a woman who was emotionally unpredictable, who would use guilt and emotional blackmail to get her way, who would play victim whenever she was confronted about her behavior. "And how did you respond to her manipulation?" his therapist asked. Marcus paused, and in that pause the shadow began to emerge. "I learned to manipulate her back," he said quietly. "I learned to read her moods, to say what she wanted to hear, to play the good son when I needed something from her. I became incredibly skilled at emotional manipulation because it was the only way to survive in that household." This was Marcus's shadow revelation. The manipulative behavior that enraged him in others was actually his own disowned manipulation reflected back at him. He had become so skilled at subtle emotional manipulation that he'd forgotten he was doing it. He would manipulate clients into staying in therapy longer than necessary. He would use his professional authority to get compliance. He would employ therapeutic techniques to control the direction of sessions rather than following the client's natural process. But because Marcus had never owned this part of himself, because he had exiled his manipulative tendencies into the shadow, he was blind to his own behavior while being hypervigilant about the same behavior in others. His unconscious manipulation felt natural and justified to him, while others' manipulation felt obvious and wrong. This is how shadow projection operates. We become unconscious of our own difficult qualities while becoming hyperconscious of those same qualities in others. We develop sophisticated blind spots around our own behavior while developing laser-sharp vision for detecting the same behavior elsewhere. We become the person who can spot arrogance in others from a mile away, but can't see our own arrogance. We become the individual who is incredibly sensitive to others' selfishness, but oblivious to our own self-centered behavior. Jung understood that this projection mechanism serves an important psychological function. It allows us to maintain our idealized self-image by exporting all the unacceptable material onto other people. Instead of facing our own complexity, our own darkness, our own human messiness, we can point to others and say, "At least I'm not like that." This creates what Jung called the moral inflation of the ego. We get to feel superior, evolved, and righteous by comparison to all those unconscious people who are displaying the very qualities we've disowned in ourselves. We become addicted to the feeling of being better than others, not realizing that this superiority is built on a massive self-deception. But here's what's truly devastating about shadow projection. It keeps us trapped in cycles of unconscious behavior while convincing us that we're conscious. Marcus could spend years in therapy working on his anger issues without ever recognizing that his anger was actually a defense against owning his manipulative tendencies. He could read books about dealing with difficult people without ever realizing that he was often the difficult person in other people's stories. The shadow projection mechanism is so sophisticated that it can turn even our spiritual growth into another form of unconscious behavior. we can become the person who judges others for being judgmental. We can develop spiritual superiority about how evolved we are compared to all those unconscious people. We can become addicted to being the one who sees through everyone else's illusions while remaining blind to our own. This is why Jung insisted that shadow work, the process of recognizing and integrating our disowned qualities, is the most important psychological work we can do. Because until you own your shadow, until you recognize the manipulator, the controller, the victim, the bully, the coward, and every other disowned aspect within yourself, you'll continue to live in a projected world where everyone else is the problem. The shadow contains not just our negative qualities, but also our disowned positive ones. The person whose creativity you envy may be showing you your own creative potential that you've never allowed yourself to express. The individual whose confidence irritates you may be reflecting your own natural confidence that you've suppressed out of fear of seeming arrogant. The someone whose freedom triggers your resentment may be mirroring your own unexpressed desire for liberation. Jung discovered that we don't just project our darkness onto others, we project our light as well. We give away our power by seeing others as more talented, more confident, more evolved, or more capable than ourselves. We become fans and followers of people who are simply expressing qualities that we possess but have never owned. This positive projection is just as imprisoning as negative projection because it keeps us from claiming our own gifts. Instead of developing our creativity, we worship creative people. Instead of cultivating our confidence, we admire confident people. Instead of expressing our wisdom, we defer to wise people. We turn other human beings into gods and ourselves into worshippers, not recognizing that we're worshiping our own disowned divinity. The path out of projection begins with radical self-honesty, the willingness to consider that every person who triggers you is actually showing you something about yourself. This doesn't mean that their behavior is acceptable or that you shouldn't have boundaries. It means that your emotional charge about their behavior is information about your own unconscious material. Here's a practical shadow work exercise that can revolutionize your self-understanding. For the next week, every time someone irritates, angers, or triggers you, instead of focusing on what's wrong with them, ask yourself these questions. How might I display this same quality in more subtle or socially acceptable ways? Where in my life do I exhibit this behavior that I'm judging in them? What would it mean about me if I owned this quality instead of projecting it? How might this person be serving as a teacher, showing me my own disowned material? This practice will be uncomfortable because the ego would much rather focus on other people's problems than examine its own. The ego loves being the victim of other people's unconscious behavior because it gets to feel superior and righteous. But if you're willing to use every trigger as a mirror, if you're brave enough to see your projections as information about your own psyche, you'll discover something remarkable. The world stops being full of irritating people and becomes full of teachers. Marcus's transformation began when he stopped trying to change his manipulative clients and started investigating his own manipulative tendencies. He began to notice how he would subtly guide conversations to get the outcomes he wanted. He started recognizing how he used his expertise to maintain control in relationships. He began to see how his need to be seen as evolved was actually another form of manipulation of his own image. This recognition was initially devastating for Marcus because it threatened his entire identity as someone who was beyond such unconscious behavior. But as he continued to own these tendencies, instead of projecting them, something unexpected happened. He became more effective as a therapist, not less. When he stopped trying to control his client's process and started trusting their natural unfolding, The therapeutic relationship deepened. When he stopped manipulating outcomes and started following the organic intelligence of the therapeutic process, real healing began to occur. This is the paradox of shadow. Integration. When you own your darkness, you actually become more light. When you acknowledge your manipulation, you become more authentic. When you recognize your selfishness, you become more genuinely generous. When you admit your cowardice, you access real courage. The shadow doesn't disappear when you integrate it. It becomes conscious. Marcus didn't stop being someone who could manipulate. He became someone who was conscious of his manipulative capacity and could choose when and how to use it skillfully. He could be strategic when strategy was called for, but he was no longer unconsciously manipulative because he was aware of this tendency. Jung understood that the goal of shadow work is not to eliminate the shadow, but to bring it into consciousness, where it can be related to consciously rather than acted out unconsciously. The integrated shadow becomes a source of power, creativity, and authentic presence because you're no longer expending energy keeping parts of yourself hidden. But here's the deepest level of shadow work that most people miss. Ultimately, you must own not just your personal shadow, but the collective shadow of humanity itself. You must recognize that every capacity for human darkness that exists anywhere exists within you as well. You are not separate from the murderer, the thief, the liar, the abuser. Given the right circumstances, the right pressure, the right conditioning, you could become any of these. This recognition is not depressing, it's liberating. Because when you acknowledge the full spectrum of human potential within yourself, you stop being naive about human nature. You develop genuine compassion for others' struggles because you recognize those same struggles within yourself. You stop being shocked by human darkness because you've made peace with your own capacity for darkness. At the same time, when you own your shadow, you also own your light. You recognize that every capacity for human greatness that exists anywhere exists within you as well. You are not separate from the saint, the healer, the artist, the lover. The same consciousness that creates beauty and wisdom and compassion in others is the consciousness that looks out through your eyes. The ultimate recognition of shadow work is that there is no separate self to have a shadow. The shadow is just another construction of the ego, another way of maintaining the illusion that you are separate from the wholeness of existence. When projection ends, when you stop seeing qualities as belonging to others rather than arising within the unified field of consciousness, the entire structure of separation begins to dissolve. But don't try to jump to this ultimate recognition too quickly. The ego loves to use spiritual concepts to avoid the messy work of actually integrating its disowned material. You cannot transcend what you have not first owned. You cannot integrate what you refuse to acknowledge. You cannot heal what you keep projecting onto others. The person who triggered you today, the individual who pressed your buttons, the someone who brought up your anger or judgment or frustration, they are your teacher. They are showing you exactly where your unconscious material is hiding. They are offering you a gift, the opportunity to reclaim a disowned part of yourself and become more whole. The question is, are you ready to stop making other people responsible for your emotional reactions? Are you willing to use every trigger as a mirror? Are you brave enough to discover that the person you've been judging is actually showing you aspects of yourself that you've never had the courage to face? Because on the other side of owning your shadow lies something extraordinary, the end of being a victim of other people's behavior. When you stop projecting your disowned material onto others, when you reclaim the parts of yourself that you've been seeing in them, you become psychologically free. You can finally relate to people as they actually are rather than as screens for your projections. This is where real love becomes possible. not the love that depends on others being who you need them to be, but the love that can embrace the full spectrum of human experience because you've embraced it within yourself. This is where authentic power emerges, not the power to control others, but the power to be whole within yourself, regardless of what others are doing. Your shadow is not your enemy. It's your unclaimed inheritance. It's the disowned parts of yourself that are waiting to be integrated into a fuller, more authentic expression of who you are. The question is, are you ready to stop running from yourself and start running toward wholeness? You are participating in a cosmic joke, and the punchline is this: the more desperately you try to control life, the more chaotic your life becomes. The tighter you grip the steering wheel, the more likely you are to crash. The harder you squeeze the water in your hands, the faster it slips through your fingers. You've been sold a lie about power that has kept you powerless, a myth about control that has left you completely out of control. Jung understood something that would shatter most people's fundamental assumptions about how to live successfully. What we call control is actually the highest form of chaos creation. Every time you try to force an outcome, you introduce resistance into a system that could otherwise flow naturally. Every time you attempt to manage all the variables, you create new variables that need to be managed. Every time you grip tighter to prevent loss, you create the very conditions that generate loss. The control addiction runs so deep in human psychology that most people can't even imagine what life would look like without constant management, manipulation, and micromanaging. They've become so identified with being the one who makes things happen that they've forgotten how to allow things to happen. They've become so addicted to the illusion of agency that they've lost touch with the intelligence of organic unfolding. Let me tell you about Jennifer, a brilliant entrepreneur who built a successful consulting business through sheer force of will. Jennifer was the person who had backup plans for her backup plans, who could anticipate problems 3 moves ahead, who managed every detail of every project with military precision. Her clients loved her because nothing ever fell through the cracks. Her team respected her because she could handle any crisis. Her friends admired her because she seemed to have everything under control. But Jennifer had a secret that she could barely admit to herself. The more successful her business became, the more chaotic her inner life felt. She was working 16-hour days trying to manage all the moving pieces. She was constantly stressed about things that hadn't even happened yet. She was exhausted from trying to anticipate and prevent every possible problem. Her need to control every aspect of her business had turned her into a prisoner of her own success. The breaking point came during what should have been the pinnacle of her career, landing a $1 million client that would take her business to the next level. Instead of celebrating, Jennifer found herself paralyzed by anxiety. The project was so complex with so many stakeholders and variables that her usual control strategies were breaking down. The harder she tried to manage every detail, the more details seemed to spiral out of her control. Jennifer's story illustrates what Jung recognized as the fundamental paradox of control. The attempt to control life actually makes life uncontrollable. When you operate from the assumption that you need to manage everything, you create a reality where everything needs to be managed. When you believe that outcomes depend entirely on your effort, you create a life where you must constantly effort to prevent catastrophe. This control addiction is not just individual pathology. It's built into the fabric of our culture. We're taught from the earliest age that successful people are those who can manage variables, anticipate problems, and force favorable outcomes. We're indoctrinated into believing that the alternative to control is chaos, that the opposite of management is disaster, that letting go means giving up. But Jung discovered something that turns this entire worldview upside down. There is an intelligence operating in life that is far more sophisticated than your conscious mind. This intelligence coordinates the movement of galaxies, orchestrates the healing of wounds, manages the complexity of ecosystems, and guides the development of embryos into fully formed beings. This same intelligence is available to guide your life, but only when you get your controlling ego out of the way. Think about your own relationship with control for a moment. How much of your mental energy is spent trying to anticipate problems that haven't happened yet? How much of your emotional capacity is consumed by worry about outcomes you can't directly influence? How often do you find yourself exhausted not by what's actually occurring, but by your attempt to manage what might occur? The control mechanism operates through a simple but devastating feedback loop. The more you try to control, the more out of control you feel, which triggers more attempts to control, which create more chaos, which generates more fear, which intensifies the need to control. You become trapped in a psychological hamster wheel, where the solution to feeling out of control is always more control, never recognizing that the attempt to control is what's creating the feeling of being out of control. Jung saw this pattern everywhere he looked, in relationships where people exhausted themselves trying to control their partner's behavior, in careers where individuals burned out trying to manage every variable, in personal growth where people turned even their consciousness work into another project to be micromanaged and optimized. The control addiction shows up in particularly subtle ways in our relationships. We try to control how others perceive us through impression management. We attempt to control their emotional responses through people-pleasing or manipulation. We exhaust ourselves trying to control the outcomes of conversations, the timing of commitments, the development of intimacy. We turn love into a strategic operation instead of an organic unfolding. Jennifer's transformation began when her million-dollar project started falling apart despite all her control efforts. Key team members quit, timelines shifted, client requirements changed, and technical problems emerged that no amount of planning could have anticipated. For the first time in her career, Jennifer was faced with a situation that was genuinely beyond her ability to manage. In that moment of complete helplessness, something unexpected happened. Instead of working harder to regain control, Jennifer found herself surrendering to the chaos. She stopped trying to force solutions and started responding to what was actually happening. She began trusting her team to handle their areas of expertise without her micromanagement. She started having authentic conversations with the client about challenges instead of trying to present a facade of perfect competence. What Jennifer discovered shocked her. When she stopped trying to control everything, everything began to work better. Her team became more creative and engaged when they weren't being micromanaged. The client relationship deepened when she stopped pretending to have all the answers. Solutions emerged organically that she never could have planned or anticipated. The project not only succeeded, but exceeded everyone's expectations. This experience gave Jennifer her first taste of what Jung called letting go, not as passive resignation, but as an active collaboration with the intelligence that governs natural systems. She began to understand that there's a difference between being responsible and being controlling, between being engaged and being micromanaging, between being strategic and being obsessed with managing outcomes. The control-chaos feedback loop operates on the principle that resistance creates persistence. When you push against life, life pushes back. When you try to force outcomes, you create counter-forces that work against your intentions. When you attempt to eliminate all variables, you introduce the variable of your own controlling behavior, which often becomes the most chaotic element in the system. Jung understood that this isn't metaphysics, it's practical psychology. When you operate from control consciousness, you're constantly in a state of subtle stress. which affects your decision-making, your creativity, your relationships, and your overall effectiveness. Control consciousness makes you rigid when you need to be flexible, reactive when you need to be responsive, and strategic when you need to be spontaneous. But here's what makes letting go so terrifying. It requires you to trust something that your rational mind can't grasp or predict. It means making decisions based on intuition rather than analysis. It means allowing outcomes to unfold rather than forcing them to conform to your preferences. It means admitting that you're not actually in charge of as much as you thought you were. The ego interprets letting go as losing power, but Jung discovered the opposite. Letting go is how you access real power. When you stop wasting energy fighting what is, you have more energy available for creative response. When you stop trying to control what's outside your control, you become more effective at influencing what is within your influence. When you stop forcing doors open, you notice the doors that are already open. This doesn't mean becoming passive or irresponsible. Letting go of control is not the same as letting go of engagement. You can be fully committed to outcomes without being attached to how those outcomes unfold. You can work diligently toward goals without needing to control every step of the process. You can be strategic without becoming obsessed with strategy. The key distinction is between what Jung called directed will and controlling will. Directed will is focused, purposeful action that remains flexible about methods and timing. Controlling will is rigid, fear-based action that tries to force specific outcomes through specific means within specific timeframes. Directed will works with life. Controlling will works against life. Think about the areas of your life where you're most controlling. Notice that these are usually the areas where you feel most anxious, most exhausted, most frustrated. Now consider, what would happen if you brought the same level of intention and commitment to these areas, but let go of your attachment to controlling the process? What if you focused on showing up authentically and skillfully while trusting the outcome to the larger intelligence that orchestrates all natural processes? This shift from control to trust is not a one-time decision but an ongoing practice. Every day, in countless small moments, you face the choice: grip tighter or hold more lightly, force the outcome or trust the process, manage the variables or respond to what emerges. Jennifer's business continued to grow, but in a completely different way. Instead of trying to control every aspect of every project, she focused on creating systems that could adapt to changing circumstances. Instead of micromanaging her team, she hired people she trusted and gave them the autonomy to do excellent work. Instead of trying to anticipate every possible problem, she developed the capacity to respond creatively to whatever challenges arose. This shift didn't make her less successful. It made her more successful with far less stress and effort. Her business became more profitable because she wasn't wasting resources on unnecessary control measures. Her team became more productive because they were empowered rather than micromanaged. Her client relationships deepened because she could be authentic about challenges instead of pretending to have everything under control. Most importantly, Jennifer discovered something that the control addiction had hidden from her. Life is inherently intelligent. When you stop interfering with natural processes through excessive management, those processes often unfold in ways that are more elegant, more efficient, and more satisfying than anything you could have planned. Jung called this natural intelligence the transcendent function, the capacity of the psyche to generate solutions that transcend the limitations of conscious planning. But this function only operates when you create space for it by getting your controlling ego out of the way. As long as you're convinced that everything depends on your management, you'll never discover what becomes possible when you collaborate with the intelligence that manages galaxies. The ultimate recognition is that control is an illusion anyway. You've never been in control of as much as you thought you were. Your heart beats without your management. Your food digests without your supervision. Your wounds heal without your micromanagement. The same intelligence that runs these processes is available to guide every aspect of your life, but only when you stop trying to do its job. The question facing you right now is, are you ready to conduct an experiment? Are you willing to identify one area of your life where you've been over-controlling and practice holding it more lightly? Are you brave enough to discover what becomes possible when you stop trying to force life, to conform to your expectations and start dancing with life as it actually unfolds? Because on the other side of the control addiction lies something extraordinary, the discovery that you are not separate from the intelligence that orchestrates natural systems. You are not outside of life trying to control it. You are life expressing itself through the unique pattern that is your individual existence. When you stop fighting this intelligence and start collaborating with it, you don't lose power. You gain access to the power that moves mountains, grows forests, and creates galaxies. The grip you've been maintaining on life is not protecting you, it's exhausting you. The control you've been exercising is not creating security, it's creating anxiety. The management you've been doing is not preventing chaos, it's generating chaos. Are you ready to let go and discover what real power looks like? There is a person you were meant to become who bears little resemblance to the person you think you should be. This authentic being lives beneath the layers of conditioning, beyond the demands of social approval, outside the boundaries of who you've been told you are. Jung called the journey toward this authentic self individuation, and he understood it as the most important work a human being can undertake, the gradual separation of your true nature from the collective programming that has shaped your identity. The privilege of a lifetime is being who you are, Jung wrote, but most people never claim this privilege because they're too busy being who they think they're supposed to be. They spend their entire lives performing a version of themselves that was designed by committee, by parents who had their own unmet needs, by cultures that profit from conformity, by societies that require predictable behavior to maintain their structures. Individuation is not self-improvement, it's self-discovery. It's not about becoming better, it's about becoming real. It's not about adding more to who you are, it's about subtracting everything that isn't actually you. It's the process of peeling away the false layers until you find the authentic core that has been waiting patiently beneath all the adaptation. The journey begins with a recognition that can be both thrilling and terrifying. You are not who you think you are. The identity you've constructed, the personality you've developed, the role you play in the world, all of this is costume, not essence. Underneath the costume is a being whose nature you may have never fully explored, whose gifts you may have never expressed, whose way of moving through the world may be completely different from how you've been living. Jung identified 4 distinct stages of individuation, each representing a deeper level of authentic self-discovery. The first stage is what he called persona identification, the unconscious adoption of social roles and expectations. This is where most people spend their entire lives, completely identified with their jobs, their relationships, their social positions, never questioning whether these external identities reflect their true nature. The second stage is encounter with the shadow, the recognition that you contain qualities and potentials that don't fit your idealized self-image. This is often the most challenging stage because it requires you to acknowledge parts of yourself that you've been taught to reject, to own aspects of your nature that don't conform to social expectations of who you should be. The third stage is what Jung called encounter with the anima animus, the integration of the contrasexual aspects of your psyche. This involves embracing qualities that your culture may have labeled as inappropriate for your gender, developing aspects of yourself that complete your wholeness rather than conforming to narrow definitions of masculinity or femininity. The fourth stage is encounter with the self, the recognition that your individual identity is actually a unique expression of a larger consciousness, that who you are is both completely personal and utterly universal, both absolutely individual and totally connected to the whole of existence. Let me introduce you to David's individuation journey, the same successful executive we met earlier, whose life looked perfect from the outside, but felt empty from the inside. David's transformation began during what he later called the crisis of the golden handcuffs, the moment when he realized that his success had become his prison. David had spent 20 years climbing the corporate ladder, accumulating achievements, building an impressive resume. He had the corner office, the six-figure salary, the respect of his peers. But at age 42, he woke up one morning with a question that shattered his entire worldview. Is this actually my life, or am I living someone else's dream? This question marked David's entry into the individuation process. For the first time, he began to examine his choices, not through the lens of external expectations, but through the question of authentic expression. He started asking himself, what do I actually want, rather than what should I want? He began exploring, who am I when I'm not trying to impress anyone, instead of how can I maintain my image? The first stage of David's individuation involved recognizing how completely he had identified with his professional persona. He wasn't David who happened to work in finance. He was a finance executive who happened to be named David. His entire sense of self was wrapped up in his job title, his income level, his professional achievements. When he imagined himself without these external markers, he felt a kind of existential vertigo, as if he might disappear entirely. But as David began to investigate his persona identification, he started to remember aspects of himself that had been buried under years of professional development. He remembered his love of music, which he had abandoned because it wasn't practical. He recalled his fascination with philosophy, which he had dismissed as irrelevant to success. He reconnected with his natural introversion, which he had trained himself to override in order to be an effective leader. This process of remembering who he was before he became who he thought he should be is crucial to individuation. Somewhere in your past, before the full weight of social conditioning took hold, you had natural inclinations, spontaneous interests, authentic ways of being that reflected your true nature. Individuation involves excavating these buried aspects of yourself and discovering how they might be expressed in your current life. David's encounter with his shadow came when he began to recognize qualities in himself that didn't fit his self-image as a successful, responsible, professional adult. He discovered that he had a rebellious streak that wanted to quit his job and travel the world. He found an artist within himself who cared more about beauty than profit. He uncovered a part of himself that was deeply tired of being responsible for everyone else's needs. At first, David judged these shadow qualities as immature, irresponsible, selfish, but as he continued his individuation work, he began to see them as essential aspects of his wholeness that had been exiled because they didn't fit the narrow definition of acceptable adult behavior. He started to explore how these qualities might be integrated into his life in constructive ways, rather than continuing to suppress them. The integration of shadow material doesn't mean acting out every impulse. It means making space for the full spectrum of your nature to exist consciously. David didn't quit his job and run away to become an artist, but he did begin to bring more creativity into his work, more rebellion against systems that didn't serve people, more attention to his own needs alongside his responsibilities to others. David's encounter with his anima, the feminine aspects of his psyche, involved recognizing qualities that his cultural conditioning had taught him to see as unmanly. He discovered his natural sensitivity, his intuitive wisdom, his capacity for nurturing and emotional depth. These qualities had been present all along but had been hidden beneath his professional armor of rational decision-making and emotional control. As David began to honor these feminine aspects of his nature, his leadership style transformed. He became more collaborative rather than authoritative, more intuitive rather than purely analytical, more emotionally intelligent rather than emotionally distant. Paradoxically, this integration of his anima made him a more effective leader, not less, because he could access a fuller range of human capacities. The final stage of David's individuation involved what Jung called encounter with the self, the recognition that his individual journey was simultaneously unique and universal. David began to understand that his personal healing was contributing to collective healing, that his individual awakening was part of humanity's evolving consciousness, that his authentic self-expression was a gift not just to himself, but to the world. This is the profound paradox of individuation. The more authentically individual you become, the more you connect with what is universal. The more you discover your unique essence, the more you recognize your fundamental unity with all existence. The journey toward being yourself is simultaneously a journey toward recognizing that the self you're becoming is not separate from the larger self that expresses itself through all forms. Jung understood that individuation is not a luxury for people who have solved all their practical problems. It's the solution to most practical problems. When you're living authentically, when you're expressing your true nature, when you're aligned with who you actually are, life begins to work more effortlessly. Opportunities arise organically, relationships deepen naturally, work becomes expression rather than obligation. This doesn't mean that individuation makes life easy. It often makes life more challenging in the short term. When David began living more authentically, he faced criticism from colleagues who preferred the predictable version of him. He experienced anxiety about whether he could succeed while being true to himself. He went through periods of confusion as old structures dissolved and new ones had not yet formed. But these challenges are birth pains, not death throes. They're the natural discomfort of growth, not evidence that you're moving in the wrong direction. Individuation requires you to trust that who you authentically are is more powerful than who you've been pretending to be, even when the evidence for this trust is not immediately visible. The individuation process is accelerated by what Jung called active imagination, the practice of engaging consciously with the unconscious material that emerges through dreams, fantasies, and spontaneous imagery. Instead of dismissing these expressions as meaningless, you learn to dialogue with them, to understand what they're trying to communicate about your authentic nature. David began keeping a dream journal and was amazed to discover how his unconscious was providing guidance about his individuation process. Dreams showed him parts of himself he had never acknowledged. Fantasies revealed desires he had never allowed himself to feel. Spontaneous images pointed toward creative expressions that his rational mind would never have considered. This dialogue with the unconscious is essential to individuation because the rational mind, no matter how sophisticated, cannot think its way to authenticity. The authentic self emerges from a deeper level of being that communicates through symbol, metaphor, feeling, and intuition. Learning to listen to this deeper intelligence is like learning a new language, the language of your soul. The individuation journey also requires what Jung called the development of inferior functions, the cultivation of capacities that don't come naturally but are necessary for wholeness. If you're naturally extroverted, individuation might involve developing your introverted capacities. If you're naturally thinking-oriented, you might need to develop your feeling function. If you're naturally intuitive, You might need to ground yourself in sensing. This development of inferior functions is often uncomfortable because it requires you to be a beginner in areas where you're used to being competent. It means accepting that wholeness includes awkwardness. That authenticity sometimes means being bad at things. That becoming yourself requires letting go of the need to be good at everything. David's inferior function was feeling. He had spent years developing his thinking and sensing capacities while suppressing his emotional intelligence. His individuation work involved learning to trust his feelings as valid sources of information, to express emotions without shame, to make decisions based on what felt right, rather than just what made logical sense. This development was initially threatening to David's professional identity because he had built his reputation on being rationally reliable. But as he integrated his feeling function, he became a more effective leader because he could read the emotional climate of his team, respond to the human needs beneath business problems, and make decisions that accounted for both logical and emotional factors. The individuation process is never complete because you are not a fixed entity to be discovered, but a dynamic process of becoming. Who you authentically are is not a static identity, but an ever-evolving expression of consciousness, exploring itself through the unique pattern that is your individual existence. This means that individuation requires ongoing attention, continuous choice, constant recommitment to authenticity over convenience. Every day you face decisions. Will you express yourself or adapt to others' expectations? Will you honor your natural rhythms or conform to external schedules? Will you speak your truth or say what others want to hear? Will you follow your genuine interests or pursue what seems most practical? The accumulation of these micro-choices determines whether you spend your life becoming more yourself or more like everyone else's version of who you should be. Individuation is not a destination you arrive at, but a direction you face, not an achievement you complete, but a practice you maintain. Jung warned that individuation is not the same as individualism, the narcissistic focus on personal desires at the expense of others' well-being. True individuation makes you more connected to others, not less, because you're relating from your authentic self rather than from your adapted persona. You have more to give because you're not depleting yourself, trying to be someone you're not. The individuated person becomes what Jung called a beneficial presence in the world, someone whose authentic being creates space for others to be authentic as well. They become permission givers rather than conformity enforcers, questions askers rather than answer demanders, authenticity modelers rather than role players. Right now, as you listen to these words, your own individuation process is calling to you. There are aspects of yourself that have been waiting patiently for your attention, qualities that have been suppressed for so long you've forgotten they exist, ways of being that are more natural to you than the ways you've learned to perform. The question facing you is not whether you're ready for individuation. Individuation is ready for you. The question is whether you're willing to begin the sometimes uncomfortable, always liberating process of discovering who you actually are beneath who you think you should be. Are you ready to let go of being perfect and risk being real? Are you prepared to disappoint some people in order to stop disappointing yourself? Are you brave enough to discover what wants to be expressed through your unique existence? Because the world doesn't need another perfectly adapted person who says the right things and plays the right roles. The world needs you, the authentic you that has never been fully expressed, the real you that has been hiding beneath years of social programming, the true you that is unlike anyone who has ever lived or ever will live again. Your individuation is not just personal healing. It's an evolutionary contribution to human consciousness. Every person who chooses authenticity over adaptation makes it easier for others to do the same. Every individual who refuses to live a borrowed life gives permission for others to discover their own authentic path. Every human being who becomes who they really are helps heal the collective wound of false identity. The journey toward yourself is the most important journey you will ever take. It's time to begin. You are not just carrying your own psychological material. You are walking through life with the accumulated patterns, traumas, and unresolved conflicts of generations who came before you. Embedded in your unconscious are the fears your great-grandmother never processed, the rage your grandfather never expressed, the grief your ancestors never fully grieved. Jung called this inherited psychological DNA the collective unconscious, and he understood that individual healing is impossible without addressing the ancestral patterns that live within your psyche. This is not metaphor, this is biology meeting psychology. Modern neuroscience has confirmed what Jung intuited. Trauma and emotional patterns can be passed down through generations via epigenetic mechanisms. The anxiety you struggle with might not be entirely your own. The depression that seems to come from nowhere might be an ancestral echo. The relationship patterns you can't seem to break might be family templates that have been running for centuries. Jung discovered that the collective unconscious operates like a vast underground river, carrying the psychological material of entire cultures, bloodlines, and human experiences across time. You tap into this river every night in your dreams. Every time you feel an inexplicable emotional charge, every moment when you react to something in a way that seems disproportionate to the actual situation. Think about the patterns that run in your family, the addiction that shows up generation after generation, the relationship dysfunction that seems to repeat with different faces but the same dynamics, the financial struggles that persist despite intelligence and effort, the emotional unavailability that gets passed down like a family heirloom nobody wants but everyone inherits. These patterns are not just learned behaviors. They're energetic inheritances, psychological programming that gets activated automatically until someone in the lineage becomes conscious enough to interrupt the transmission. Jung understood that this interruption is not just personal healing, it's ancestral healing. The completion of unfinished psychological business that has been waiting for someone with enough awareness to finally resolve it. Let me tell you about Maria, a successful artist who couldn't understand why she was terrified of financial security. Every time her career gained momentum, every time money started flowing consistently, she would unconsciously sabotage her success. She would take on projects that didn't pay well, make poor business decisions, or simply stop marketing her work effectively. She had read every book about money mindset, worked with financial advisors, and tried every practical strategy, but the pattern persisted. The breakthrough came when Maria began exploring her family history. She discovered that her great-grandmother had lost everything during the Great Depression and had spent the rest of her life in terror of financial ruin. This woman had passed down not just practical lessons about money being scarce and dangerous, but an energetic pattern of fear that got embedded in the family system. Maria's grandmother had inherited this financial anxiety and had lived her entire life in poverty consciousness. Even when there was enough money, Maria's mother had rebelled against this pattern by becoming financially successful, but had never addressed the underlying fear which created a different kind of anxiety, the constant terror that success would be taken away. Maria was carrying all of this ancestral material in her unconscious. Her self-sabotage wasn't personal weakness. It was an attempt to stay loyal to the family pattern, to avoid the imagined danger of standing out, to prevent the feared loss by never fully succeeding in the first place. She was trying to solve a problem that wasn't hers, while living a limitation that didn't belong to her. Jung understood that these ancestral patterns serve important functions within family systems. They create bonding through shared suffering. maintain group identity through common struggles, and provide a sense of belonging through mutual limitation. Breaking free from these patterns can feel like betraying your lineage, abandoning your people, or claiming a privilege that your ancestors never had. This is why ancestral healing work requires such courage. You're not just changing yourself, you're changing the trajectory of your entire bloodline. You're completing psychological work that previous generations couldn't complete. You're resolving conflicts that have been passed down for centuries. You're healing wounds that may have originated long before you were born. The collective unconscious doesn't just contain family patterns. It holds the accumulated psychological material of entire cultures and civilizations. The trauma of slavery, the wounds of war, the grief of genocide, the rage of oppression. All of this material lives in the collective field and influences individual psychology in ways that are often invisible. Jung saw this most clearly during World War II, when an entire nation became possessed by collective shadow material that had been suppressed for generations. The individual Germans who participated in atrocities were not uniquely evil. They were channels for collective psychological patterns that had never been consciously integrated. They became possessed by ancestral rage, cultural shame, and historical trauma that found expression through individual actions. This understanding has profound implications for how we think about personal responsibility and collective healing. You are simultaneously responsible for your individual choices and influenced by forces that are much larger than your personal psychology. You can't blame your actions on ancestral patterns, but you also can't fully understand your motivations without recognizing these deeper influences. Maria's healing work involved what Jung called active imagination, consciously dialoguing with the ancestral patterns that were running her life. She began to have imaginal conversations with her great-grandmother, understanding the terror this woman had experienced and the protective intention behind the financial fear. She developed compassion for her grandmother's poverty consciousness and her mother's success anxiety. But most importantly, Maria began to differentiate between honoring her ancestors and being imprisoned by their unresolved material. She could acknowledge their struggles without continuing their limitations. She could carry their wisdom without carrying their wounds. She could love her lineage without living their patterns. This differentiation is the key to ancestral healing, recognizing that you can be grateful for your inheritance without being trapped by it. Your ancestors did the best they could with the awareness they had, but their best doesn't have to become your ceiling. Their unfinished business doesn't have to become your life mission. Their unresolved conflicts don't have to become your personal struggles. Jung discovered that when you heal ancestral patterns consciously, the healing ripples both forward and backward through the lineage. Your children and grandchildren benefit from the psychological freedom you create, but somehow, mysteriously, the healing also seems to affect the ancestors themselves, as if consciousness transcends linear time and your awakening contributes to their peace. This may sound mystical, but it points to something that Jung understood about the nature of the psyche. Individual consciousness and collective consciousness are not separate phenomena, but different aspects of the same field. When you become conscious of ancestral patterns and choose to relate to them differently, you're contributing to the evolution of consciousness itself. The collective unconscious also contains what Jung called archetypes, universal patterns of human experience that show up across all cultures and time periods. The hero, the mother, the wise old man, the shadow, the anima animus. These archetypal patterns live within your psyche and influence your perceptions, relationships, and life choices in ways that are often unconscious. Understanding archetypal patterns can help you recognize when you're being lived by an archetype rather than living consciously. You might find yourself playing the victim in every story, or compulsively enacting the hero's journey in every situation, or unconsciously embodying the martyr in your relationships. These archetypal possessions limit your freedom by reducing the full spectrum of your humanity to a single pattern. Maria discovered that she had been unconsciously enacting the starving artist archetype, which was actually a combination of ancestral financial fear and cultural programming about artists needing to suffer for their art. This archetypal pattern made financial success feel like a betrayal of artistic integrity, creating an internal conflict between abundance and authenticity. Healing archetypal possessions involves the same process as healing ancestral patterns: recognition, dialogue, differentiation, and conscious relationship. You can work with archetypal energies when they serve your authentic expression, but you don't have to be possessed by them when they limit your wholeness. The collective unconscious also contains the accumulated wisdom of humanity, the insights, discoveries, and evolutionary leaps that previous generations have made. This wisdom is available to you through what Jung called the wisdom of the ages, but only when you're not being overwhelmed by the traumatic material that often obscures it. As Maria healed her ancestral financial patterns, she began to access collective wisdom about abundance, creativity, and the relationship between material and spiritual wealth. She discovered that her great-grandmother, despite her financial fears, had actually been incredibly resourceful and creative in surviving difficult times. This strength and creativity were also part of Maria's inheritance, but they had been hidden beneath the fear. Jung understood that the goal of working with the collective unconscious is not to eliminate its influence, but to develop a conscious relationship with it. You cannot separate yourself from the collective field, but you can choose how to relate to the patterns and energies that move through it. This conscious relationship requires what Jung called holding the tension of opposites, maintaining your individual awareness while staying connected to collective wisdom, honoring ancestral experience while creating new patterns, carrying cultural inheritance while contributing to cultural evolution. The practice of ancestral healing often involves ritual and ceremony, conscious acts that honor the past while creating space for new possibilities. Maria created a ritual in which she imagined sitting in a circle with the women in her lineage, acknowledging their struggles and expressing gratitude for their survival, while also clearly stating her intention to live differently. These rituals are not just symbolic, they're energetic interventions that help shift unconscious patterns. When you consciously engage with ancestral material through ceremony, you're creating what Jung called a new attitude toward the unconscious, transforming passive inheritance into active engagement. The healing of ancestral patterns often accelerates during what Jung called the midlife transition, the period when individual concerns begin to expand into concern for the collective. This is when many people begin to feel responsible not just for their own healing, but for healing the lineage, contributing to cultural transformation and leaving a better psychological inheritance for future generations. But you don't have to wait for midlife to begin this work. Ancestral healing can begin at any age, when you're ready to take responsibility not just for your personal patterns, but for the collective patterns that express themselves through your individual life. The question facing you is, what patterns are you carrying that don't actually belong to you? What limitations are you living that were inherited rather than chosen? What fears, beliefs, and behaviors are you expressing that might be ancestral material seeking resolution through your consciousness? Take a moment to consider the patterns that run in your family system. Notice which ones you've unconsciously adopted, which ones you've rebelled against, and which ones you've never questioned. Consider the possibility that some of your deepest struggles might not be entirely personal. They might be ancestral invitations to complete unfinished psychological business. This recognition is not meant to remove personal responsibility, but to expand it. You're not just responsible for your individual choices. You're participating in the healing and evolution of consciousness itself. Every pattern you heal consciously contributes to collective healing. Every limitation you transcend makes transcendence more available for others. Every ancestral wound you complete helps heal the entire lineage. Jung saw individual therapy not just as personal healing, but as cultural medicine. When you heal your own psychological patterns, you're contributing to the healing of the collective patterns that create suffering for many people. When you break free from ancestral limitations, you're creating new possibilities for everyone in your lineage and beyond. The collective unconscious is not just a repository of problems to be solved. It's also a source of wisdom, strength, and creative potential. Your ancestors survived incredible challenges, developed remarkable skills, and accessed profound wisdom. This resilience, creativity, and insight are also part of your inheritance, waiting to be accessed when you're no longer overwhelmed by the traumatic material. Maria's full healing involved not just releasing ancestral financial fear, but also reclaiming ancestral creativity, resourcefulness, and survival wisdom. She discovered that her great-grandmother had been not just traumatized by loss, but had been remarkably creative in building a life from nothing. This creativity was also part of Maria's DNA, but it had been hidden beneath the fear. The work of ancestral healing is ultimately the work of conscious evolution, taking the best of what came before while creating space for something new to emerge. You honor your ancestors by healing what they couldn't heal, by expressing what they couldn't express, by becoming who they didn't have the freedom to become. This is your invitation, to become not just an individual seeking personal healing, but an evolutionary agent participating in the healing and transformation of consciousness itself. Your personal growth is not just personal, it's ancestral, it's collective, it's evolutionary. You are not just healing yourself, you are healing the lineage, contributing to cultural transformation, and participating in the evolution of human consciousness. Are you ready to take responsibility, not just for your individual patterns, but for the collective patterns that express themselves through your life? Are you prepared to become an ancestor that future generations will be grateful for, rather than patterns they'll need to heal? Are you willing to complete the unfinished business that has been waiting for someone with your level of consciousness to finally resolve? Because the ancestors are not just behind you, they are within you, waiting for your consciousness to give them the resolution they never achieved. The future generations are not just ahead of you, they are depending on you to create better psychological inheritance than the one you received. You are the bridge between what was and what could be, the conscious link in an evolutionary chain that extends far beyond your individual life. Your healing is their healing. Your freedom is their freedom. Your consciousness is their consciousness, finding expression through your individual awareness, to complete work that spans generations. This is the profound responsibility and the extraordinary opportunity of being alive at this moment in human history. There is an intelligence operating in reality that is far more sophisticated than your conscious mind, and it communicates with you through what appear to be coincidences. Jung called these meaningful coincidences synchronicity, and he understood them as evidence of a deeper order underlying the apparent randomness of existence, an order that becomes visible only when you stop trying to force your way through life and start learning to dance with the mysterious intelligence that orchestrates the movement of everything. Synchronicity is not luck, and it's not chance. It's the universe's way of showing you that you are not separate from the intelligence that grows forests, heals wounds, and coordinates the movement of galaxies. When you align with this intelligence instead of fighting against it, when you learn to flow with the natural rhythms of existence instead of imposing your own timeline, life begins to respond to you in ways that seem miraculous but are actually natural. Most people live their entire lives completely cut off from this natural flow because they've been conditioned to believe that success comes from pushing, forcing, and making things happen through sheer effort. They operate from the assumption that they are separate from life and must therefore manipulate life from the outside. This creates a relationship of constant struggle where every outcome requires tremendous effort and stress. But Jung discovered something that changes everything. You are not separate from the intelligence that runs natural systems. You are that intelligence, expressing itself through the unique pattern that is your individual existence. When you recognize this truth and learn to align with it instead of fighting against it, synchronicity becomes a normal part of your experience. Let me introduce you to Thomas, a struggling entrepreneur who spent 3 years trying to force his business idea into existence. Thomas had a vision for a sustainable technology company that would revolutionize renewable energy. He had the technical knowledge, the business plan, the passion, and the commitment. But despite 18-hour days, despite exhausting his savings, despite following every piece of business advice he could find, nothing was working. Investors weren't interested. Partners kept backing out. Technical problems emerged that he hadn't anticipated. Customers were slow to adopt the product. Every step forward seemed to require enormous effort, and every gain was followed by unexpected setbacks. Thomas was beginning to wonder if he simply wasn't cut out for entrepreneurship. The turning point came when Thomas reached complete exhaustion. He had pushed himself to the breaking point and realized that he couldn't continue forcing his vision into reality through willpower alone. In that moment of surrender, something shifted. Instead of pushing harder, Thomas began to pay attention to what was naturally emerging, what doors were actually opening, what opportunities were presenting themselves without his having to create them. What Thomas discovered was that while he had been struggling to force his original business idea into existence, life had been offering him a completely different opportunity that he had been ignoring because it didn't match his predetermined plan. Through a series of what seemed like random conversations and unexpected connections, a different business possibility had been emerging, one that required far less effort but offered far more potential for impact. This new opportunity had come through what Jung would call a series of synchronicities. A chance meeting at a coffee shop with someone who mentioned a problem they were trying to solve, followed by an unexpected email from a former colleague about a similar challenge, followed by a news article about exactly the market gap that Thomas was uniquely positioned to fill. When Thomas finally stopped forcing his original plan and followed the natural flow of these synchronicities, his business took off with an ease that amazed him. Funding appeared organically. The right team members showed up naturally. Customers found him without expensive marketing. Technical solutions emerged through unexpected collaborations. What had required years of struggle suddenly began flowing effortlessly. This is how synchronicity works. When you stop forcing your agenda onto life and start paying attention to life's agenda for you, you discover that reality is incredibly responsive to authentic intention, combined with surrender to natural timing. Jung understood that synchronicity operates according to different principles than cause and effect thinking. Synchronistic events are connected not by linear causation, but by meaning, resonance, and energetic alignment. They represent moments when your inner state and external circumstances come into perfect harmony, creating openings that couldn't be manufactured through effort alone. The key to working with synchronicity is learning to distinguish between forcing and allowing, between pushing and flowing, between manipulation and alignment. Forcing is when you try to make something happen according to your timeline and your methods. Allowing is when you hold clear intention, while remaining open to how and when that intention might manifest. Thomas learned to work with what Jung called meaningful attention, a state of relaxed awareness that notices patterns, connections, and opportunities that the goal-focused mind usually misses. Instead of being so fixated on his predetermined outcome that he missed alternative possibilities, Thomas became curious about what was trying to emerge through his situation. This shift from forcing to allowing doesn't mean becoming passive or abandoning goals. It means learning to hold your intentions lightly while staying deeply engaged with the process. It means being committed to outcomes while remaining flexible about methods. It means trusting that the intelligence that coordinates natural systems can coordinate your life circumstances as well, if you learn to collaborate with it instead of overriding it. Jung discovered that synchronicity tends to increase when you're living authentically, when your outer actions are aligned with your inner truth, when you're following your genuine path rather than someone else's definition of success. This alignment creates what he called the transcendent function, a capacity to bridge conscious intention with unconscious wisdom, personal will with transpersonal intelligence. The blocking of synchronicity usually happens through what Jung called inflation of the ego, the belief that you must control every aspect of how your life unfolds. When you operate from the assumption that everything depends on your conscious effort, you create energetic resistance that blocks the natural flow of opportunities, resources, and support. Think about your own relationship with synchronicity. How often do you notice meaningful coincidences in your life? How frequently do you experience the sense that life is supporting your authentic path? How regularly do you encounter exactly the right person, resource, or opportunity at exactly the right time? If synchronicity seems rare in your experience, it's likely because you're pushing so hard toward predetermined outcomes that you're missing the signals life is sending about alternative possibilities. You're so focused on making things happen that you're not paying attention to what's trying to happen naturally. The cultivation of synchronicity requires what Jung called active patience, the ability to maintain clear intention while surrendering control over timing and methods. This is different from passive waiting, which lacks engagement, and different from anxious forcing, which blocks natural flow. Active patience is engaged surrender, committed openness, intentional receptivity. Thomas developed this capacity through practices that Jung associated with the development of intuition. He began meditating regularly to quiet the constant mental chatter that obscured subtle guidance. He started paying attention to his dreams and the symbolic messages they contained. He learned to notice his gut feelings and spontaneous inspirations as valid sources of information. Most importantly, Thomas began treating every unexpected event as potentially meaningful rather than dismissing coincidences as random. When someone mentioned a book he'd been thinking about reading, he paid attention. When he kept encountering the same message through different sources, he investigated what it might mean. When obstacles kept appearing around certain actions while doors kept opening around others, he followed the path of least resistance. This doesn't mean that Thomas stopped taking action or became superstitious about every random event. It means that he developed discernment about when to push and when to yield, when to effort and when to allow, when to follow his plan, and when to follow the plan that seemed to be emerging through his circumstances. Jung understood that synchronicity is not just a psychological phenomenon, it's evidence of what he called the participation mystique, the recognition that individual consciousness and cosmic intelligence are not separate phenomena but different aspects of the same field. When you align with this field instead of trying to manipulate it from outside, you gain access to resources, timing, and opportunities that individual effort alone cannot provide. The experience of flow states where action becomes effortless and time seems to disappear represents moments when this alignment is complete. Athletes describe being in the zone. Artists talk about inspiration flowing through them, and entrepreneurs report business deals that fell into place naturally. These are all descriptions of consciousness aligning with the natural intelligence that orchestrates all systems. But synchronicity and flow are not just available during peak performance moments. They can become the normal operating mode of a life lived in alignment with natural principles. This requires what Jung called the development of the intuitive function, the capacity to receive information through channels other than linear thinking. Most people have been so conditioned to rely exclusively on rational analysis that they've atrophied their capacity to receive intuitive guidance. They've forgotten how to sense when something is aligned versus when it's forced, how to feel when timing is right versus when it's premature, how to recognize when they're flowing with natural currents versus swimming against them. The development of intuitive capacity requires learning to trust sources of information that can't be verified through logical analysis. It means paying attention to subtle energetic signals, gut feelings, spontaneous inspirations, and the feeling tone of different possibilities. It means learning to distinguish between ego-based desires and authentic callings, between fear-based resistance and natural timing. Thomas discovered that his previous business failures hadn't been evidence of incompetence. They had been the result of trying to force ideas that weren't aligned with natural timing or authentic calling. When he learned to sense the difference between inspiration and desperation, between natural enthusiasm and forced excitement, between organic opportunity and manufactured possibilities, his success rate increased dramatically. Jung warned about the potential misuse of synchronicity thinking, using it to avoid taking responsibility for practical action or turning every random event into a cosmic message. The healthy relationship with synchronicity involves holding both and rather than either or, both taking practical action and remaining open to unexpected assistance, both making plans and staying flexible about how those plans unfold, both working diligently and trusting that your efforts are supported by larger intelligence. The ultimate understanding of synchronicity is that you are not a separate individual trying to manipulate an external reality. You are consciousness itself, exploring its own infinite potential through the unique perspective that is your individual experience. When this recognition stabilizes, synchronicity stops feeling miraculous and starts feeling natural, because you're no longer surprised that consciousness responds to consciousness, that intelligence supports intelligence, that love attracts love. Thomas's business eventually became more successful than his original plan had envisioned, but not through the path he had initially mapped out. By learning to dance with synchronicity, rather than trying to control outcomes, he discovered possibilities that his rational mind could never have imagined. More importantly, he found that work became play, effort became flow, and business became a form of creative expression rather than stressful struggle. The invitation of synchronicity is to experiment with a different way of moving through life. Instead of leading with force, try leading with attention. Instead of pushing toward predetermined outcomes, try following the natural currents that are already moving in your direction. Instead of trying to make everything happen, try paying attention to what's trying to happen and see how you can support it. This doesn't mean abandoning goals or becoming passive about your life direction. It means holding your intentions clearly while remaining curious about how they might manifest in ways you haven't considered. It means staying committed to your authentic path while remaining flexible about the specific form that path might take. Right now, as you listen to these words, notice what's been trying to emerge in your life that you might have been ignoring because it doesn't match your predetermined plan. What doors have been opening that you haven't walked through because they lead in a different direction than you expected? What synchronicities have you dismissed as coincidence because they challenged your assumptions about how things should unfold? The intelligence that coordinates the movement of planets and grows forests from tiny seeds is the same intelligence that can coordinate the circumstances of your life, if you learn to collaborate with it instead of trying to override it. Synchronicity is not a special favor granted to lucky people. It's the natural result of aligning individual will with universal intelligence, personal desire with cosmic flow, human intention with natural timing. Are you ready to stop forcing your life into the shape you think it should take and start discovering the shape it wants to naturally become? Are you willing to trust that the same intelligence that runs your heartbeat can coordinate your life circumstances? Are you prepared to dance with mystery instead of demanding certainty, to flow with timing instead of imposing your schedule, to allow miracles instead of manufacturing outcomes? Because once you learn to recognize synchronicity and align with natural flow, you'll discover that life has been trying to support your highest expression all along. You've just been pushing so hard in one direction that you haven't noticed the gentle currents carrying you toward possibilities more beautiful than anything you could have planned. There will come a moment in your psychological development when everything that once felt solid begins to dissolve. The identity you've spent years constructing starts to feel like a costume that no longer fits. The goals that once motivated you seem suddenly meaningless. The relationships that once sustained you feel distant and disconnected. The spiritual practices that once provided comfort offer no relief. You find yourself in what Jung called the dark night of the soul, the terrifying and necessary passage through dissolution that precedes authentic rebirth. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious, Jung wrote. The dark night of the soul is not a spiritual emergency or a sign that something has gone wrong. It's the natural and inevitable process of psychological death that must occur before psychological rebirth becomes possible. It's the ego's experience of dissolving as consciousness recognizes its true nature beyond all constructed identities. Most people spend enormous energy trying to avoid this passage. They distract themselves with busyness, medicate themselves with substances or activities, or desperately grasp at new identities and roles to replace the ones that are dissolving. But Jung understood that this dissolution is not optional. It's the price of authentic awakening, the necessary disintegration that allows for true integration. The dark night usually begins with what seems like an external crisis, the end of a relationship, the loss of a job, a health challenge, the death of someone close to you. But Jung recognized that these external events are often precipitated by an internal shift that has been building beneath conscious awareness. Your soul has outgrown your current identity structure, and life begins to remove the supports that have been keeping an inauthentic version of yourself in place. Let me tell you about Catherine, a successful psychotherapist who had built her entire identity around helping others heal from trauma. For 15 years, Catherine had been the person everyone turned to during difficult times. Her practice was thriving, her reputation was stellar, and her sense of purpose seemed unshakable. She considered herself fortunate to have found work that felt like a calling rather than just a career. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, something began to shift. Catherine started feeling disconnected during therapy sessions, going through the motions of techniques that had once felt inspired. She found herself exhausted by her clients' problems in ways she had never experienced before. The work that had once energized her began to drain her, and she couldn't understand why. Then came the external crisis that precipitated Catherine's dark night. A former client filed a malpractice lawsuit, alleging that Catherine's treatment had made their condition worse. Even though the lawsuit was ultimately dismissed, the experience shattered Catherine's confidence in ways that surprised her. She began questioning everything: her competence, her methods, her entire identity as a healer. What followed was a descent into what Catherine later described as the void, a period where nothing felt real or meaningful. She couldn't generate enthusiasm for her work. She felt disconnected from friends and family. The spiritual practices that had once sustained her felt empty and mechanical. She was experiencing what Jung called the loss of soul, the death of the psychological structure that had organized her entire sense of self. Catherine's first instinct was to fight against this dissolution. She read self-help books about overcoming depression. She increased her meditation practice, hoping to regain her spiritual connection. She went to therapy herself, trying to analyze her way out of the darkness. But nothing worked because she was trying to fix something that wasn't broken. She was trying to prevent a natural process that needed to complete itself. Jung understood that the dark night of the soul serves a crucial function in psychological development. It's the psyche's way of clearing out structures that have become too small to contain your expanding consciousness. The identity that once served your growth has become a limitation, and it must be composted so that something more authentic can emerge. This process is terrifying because it involves the literal death of who you think you are. The ego interprets this dissolution as actual annihilation, which triggers every survival mechanism you possess. You feel like you're dying because, from the ego's perspective, you are dying. The version of yourself that you've been identified with is dissolving, and there's no guarantee of what will replace it. Catherine's dark night involved the death of her identity as the healer. This persona had served important functions in her life. It had given her a sense of purpose, provided social recognition, and allowed her to feel valuable and needed. But it had also become a prison that prevented her from receiving care, expressing vulnerability, and exploring other aspects of her nature. The lawsuit had threatened this identity in ways that revealed how completely she had become identified with being the person who fixes others. When this role was challenged, Catherine realized she had no idea who she was beyond her function as a therapist. She had been so busy healing everyone else that she had never explored what she might need for her own healing. Jung called this the inflation of the helping persona, the unconscious identification with being the one who has it together, who has the answers, who can handle everyone else's problems. This inflation creates a kind of spiritual loneliness because you become unable to receive support from others or acknowledge your own need for healing. The dark night strips away these inflated identities and forces you to face the raw reality of your humanity. Catherine had to confront her own unhealed trauma, her own unmet needs, her own capacity for woundedness. She discovered that beneath her competent healer persona was a part of herself that desperately needed healing but had never felt safe to express it. This recognition was initially devastating because it challenged the foundation of Catherine's self-worth. If she wasn't the person who had it together, if she wasn't uniquely capable of healing others, then what was her value? Who was she if she wasn't special, evolved, or spiritually advanced? Jung understood that this deflation of spiritual ego is one of the most important passages in psychological development. The person who thinks they're more conscious than others, more healed than others, more evolved than others, is still operating from separation consciousness. True awakening involves the recognition that you're not special, you're universal, not different from others, but the same consciousness, expressing itself through apparent individuality. Catherine's healing began when she stopped trying to escape the dark night and started exploring what it might be teaching her. Instead of seeing her depression as something to overcome, she began investigating what the depression might be trying to communicate. Instead of viewing her loss of purpose as a problem to solve, she started considering whether her old sense of purpose had been limiting her fuller expression. This shift from resistance to curiosity, from trying to fix to learning to listen, marks the beginning of conscious navigation through the dark night. Jung called this holding the tension of the opposites, maintaining awareness while allowing contradiction, staying present while everything familiar dissolves, trusting the process while not knowing where it's leading. The dark night often involves what Jung called the encounter with meaninglessness, the dissolution of all the stories, beliefs, and purposes that have given life meaning. This can be profoundly disorienting because the human mind craves narrative coherence, causal explanations, and clear purposes. When these structures dissolve, you're left facing the apparent randomness and purposelessness of existence. But Jung discovered that this encounter with meaninglessness is actually an encounter with meaning that is too large to be contained by any conceptual structure. The dissolution of personal meaning opens space for transpersonal meaning to emerge. The death of individual purpose allows universal purpose to be recognized. Catherine's experience of meaninglessness gradually revealed itself as meaning beyond personal story. When her identity as the special healer dissolved, she discovered her connection to the universal impulse toward healing that expresses itself through all beings. When her personal sense of purpose collapsed, she recognized her participation in purposes much larger than individual achievement. This recognition doesn't eliminate the human experience of confusion, sadness, or disorientation during the dark night. It simply provides a larger context within which these experiences can be held. You're not going crazy. You're coming sane. You're not falling apart. You're falling together in a completely new way. You're not losing yourself. You're discovering what you are beyond all constructed identities.